I am now recording because I forgot to start recording earlier, but this webinar is now being recorded. And then lastly, there should be the video feed window may block part of the presentation. You should be able to click and drag that video window wherever you want on the screen to get it out of your way. All right, so having gone through that, welcome again to the impacts of COVID-19 on power demand. This webinar is brought to you by us at Tesla, but also NAEMA, and I thank them for inviting us to speak to their members. They did want me to say that, as you know, they were forced to cancel their 2020 fall and spring conferences due to the pandemic. But rather than wait until next spring's conference to offer educational presentations to its members and industry participants, NAEMA will be hosting periodic virtual presentations over the next several months. NAEMA takes its mission of providing education and networking opportunities very seriously, and we'll be working on some networking alternatives in the very near future as well. Let's see. Here's that contact information for the folks at NAEMA. And then they've also asked me to read part of their antitrust policy. It is the policy and practice of NAEMA and its members at all times to act in accordance with all state and federal antitrust laws and to avoid all conduct that unreasonably restrains competition. This policy requires the avoidance of any conduct that violates or might appear to violate the antitrust laws. NAEMA and its members will not discuss or enter into any agreement between or among competitors regarding prices, items that affect price, availability of service, division of markets, or allocation of customers, and will not engage in any other activity that unreasonably restrains competition or otherwise violates the antitrust laws. Nothing in this policy is meant to prevent members from contracting with each other for the provision of energy. And if you're interested, the entire antitrust policy is available at their website, www.naema.com. So for those of you who may not be familiar with us, what we do at Tesla Incorporated, we operate globally. We have 3 offices around the world. I work in our Richmond, Virginia office, serving our clients in the Americas, North and South. We have an office in London, servicing clients in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And then out of Auckland, we service the Asia Pacific markets. We've been forecasting load since 1992. Electric load is our bread and butter. We've done some other energy industry forecasting, but the bulk of our work is in load. We serve all different kinds of customers, utilities, IOUs, GNTs, co-ops and munis, and then we also have products for market participants. We cover all of the, out of this office, we cover all of the North American energy markets. Recently now we've added the Mexican energy market. Okay, so what I'm going to try to accomplish on this webinar is, first and foremost, I want to walk through some of the methods that we use to assess the impact that COVID-19 is having on load. Then we'll see how we've applied those methods and what we've learned so far. And then lastly, we'll take a look and see, given what we've learned, what might we expect in the weeks and months to come. So starting with the methodology, I think it's intuitive for a lot of folks to want to just compare, 2019 load to 2020 load and call it a day. But there are lots of different reasons why 2020 load might be lower than 2019, and COVID-19 is just one of them. So in order to get a little bit of a better picture, we take 2 different approaches, both of which start with our standard Tesla model. And I won't run through all of it here, but it'll be important later for me to point out now that every Tesla model is really a collection of 6 models, 3 of which are heating regime models, 3 of which are cooling regime models. So we delineate the sample that way. And then also point out that we spend a lot of time and energy collecting school schedule data. So different districts around the country, one of the kids in school, one of the kids out of school, and also with holidays. We spend a lot of time modeling around those 2 things, and I think that'll be of importance later. So the first approach that we've taken starts with what I call COVID unaware modeling. And basically, I mean, that's a very simple concept. We basically take data from the pre-COVID era, and I believe we truncated all of our samples in late February at the latest. And then we predicate or substantiate a standard testing model using only that data. And then lastly, we initialize that model with observed weather for the period of interest. So in this case, March through present. And so what that does, it allows us to establish a baseline. That simulation is our best guess at what load would have been if COVID-19 had never occurred. And that's the orange line here in this graph. And I'll also note that in most of the graphs that I'll present today, we're looking at daily average loads. That helps us get a better sense of the level shift in the data. But all of this is predicated on hourly data. And then the blue line here is the actual load, daily averages, and that's our comparison in this no COVID simulation approach. So the difference between those two curves is a couple of things. One, because we are using our model to generate that simulation baseline, we have to acknowledge that model error is part of the difference there. Second, outages are also in there. They're typically negligible, especially at the RTO total level, like MISO total here. But they do manifest as drops in observed load, so they can muddy the analysis here, and we'll actually see examples of that later on. And then there's also the impact of COVID-19 is in that gap as well. So here I've applied that methodology to the ERCOT market, and we'll see a lot of graphs like this one over the next 30 minutes. And if you've received our biweekly analysis, we put together graphs like this for all of the wholesale markets. So you may have seen this before. In all these graphs, I try to maintain the convention that the orange line is our baseline, in this case, the no COVID simulation. The blue line here is our comparison, which in this case is the observed load. And then the gray bars are all individual daily losses. And I've measured that as the difference between the baseline and comparison as a percentage of the baseline. So if the simulation represents what load would have been, how much of that did we lose as a result of COVID-19? And so that's what these gray bars represent. And then the green line is just a 7-day moving average of those gray bars to give us a quick visual. And so what we can see in the case of ERCOT, a steady, steep decline over about 7 weeks time at the start, followed by a much less steep and much less steady recovery over the summer months up to the present. So that was our no COVID simulation approach. The next approach starts with COVID aware modeling versus unaware. And this is what we have to do on a day-to-day basis, for all of our clients in order to be able to forecast the next hour, the next day, next week in this uncertain COVID regime we're in. We've had to take a few steps to adjust our traditional models. One thing that we did early on, as I mentioned, we spent a lot of time modeling school schedules and when kids are in or out of school at different times of year, whether that be for teacher work days or Thanksgiving holidays or what have you. And so one of the first quarantine measures taken was to shut down a lot of the schools. And so we were able to relatively quickly tell all of our models, forget the school schedules we programmed, at the start of the school year. Now go ahead and assume that all the kids are out of school, and let's forecast on that basis. So we were able to get some early punch out of measures taken there. Obviously, school closings is not the only quarantine factor at play impacting load. So we've also used a series of binary variables or variations on binary variables to try and capture changes in sort of quarantine regimes. And that's easier to do in some places than in others. New Zealand, for instance, they have very well-defined phases of quarantine. Phase 4 is total lockdown. In phase 1, you can pretty much do everything but wear a mask in public, that kind of thing. And they also are very precise about when they enter one phase and exit another. So it makes the modeling a lot easier for us. Unfortunately, our analysts in the PJM region aren't as fortunate, where you have a dozen or more states, each with tens, if not hundreds of localities with their own policies. So it requires a little bit more of a keener eye to try to pinpoint shifts in quarantine policies. And then we've also manipulated our holidays a bit to try and get at forecasting during the COVID regime. We've done that in two different ways, depending on where it makes sense. In some places, well, in all of our models, we forecast our holidays, by which I mean national holidays, work holidays, so offices closed, kids out of school, stuff like that. We model those with our Sunday samples because the shapes typically mirror Sunday shapes more than any other day of the week. And in some cases, we've seen, okay, during quarantine, offices are closed, some retail is still open, kids are out of school. This doesn't look terribly unlike a Sunday or a holiday. And so we have basically told our models, just assume this random Tuesday in June is actually a national holiday. And so we were able to get some punch out of that. But also when we've seen actual holidays, and we've seen Easter, Memorial Day, and the 4th so far in this COVID regime, we've had to tell the model, actually, no, that's not a holiday. Treat it like a regular day. Because people, as much as they might want to do the things they would normally do, are not able to. So the behavior does more closely resemble a normal day than it would the holiday itself. So those are some of the measures we've taken to try and put together what I call a COVID-aware model and forecast load on a daily basis. So the weather-adjusted load approach to measuring the COVID-19 impact starts with that same COVID-aware model. And then we initialize that model with observed weather for the period in question, so March to August there. And because this model is predicated on data that runs through August, and it is COVID aware, and we're using observed weather, the difference we get when we run that solution is the pure model error. We then take that same model and initialize it with normal weather over the same solution period. And that's the idea there, is to get at what does our model think load would have been if weather were normal, as opposed to whatever we actually observed. And then because we know we're dealing with a model which has built-in error, and in this case we're able to actually quantify that error, we just add it back to the normal weather solution. And that is what we call weather-adjusted load. And that's our best guess at what load would have been if the weather had been normal. And we do that so that we can take the vagaries of one year being hotter than another out of the equation and get an apples-to-apples comparison. So in this approach, our baseline is the weather-adjusted load for 2019, and that's the orange line here. And then our comparison is the same measure for 2020. Now here, in this case, the difference represents, model error is not in there because we've added it back, but I should note that we've been using this year-over-year weather-adjusted load comparison for decades now to help our clients understand the growth or decline in their base load. So if they have, a cold year and a hot year next to each other, let's discern. They want to be able to discern, what's the real growth. So that's the point of this methodology. So that's naturally baked into this gap here. But we also have to acknowledge that baked into that gap is the impact of COVID-19. Typically, most systems are growing, so you would see positive. So we can get a sense of what COVID-19 is doing to load by taking this approach. And so here I've applied that to ERCOT. Very similar graph. I use the orangish yellow color for the average losses here to signify the change in methodology. But what we see is really the same pattern that we saw with the no COVID simulation approach. So comparing the two methods, the no COVID simulation methodology, it's weather neutral. Both the baseline and comparison are based on observed weather. Model error is a factor. I have to acknowledge that. As low as we try to keep it, it is non-zero. This approach can be confused by outages because the comparison is actual load. And I think most importantly, this approach is static. I think this is the biggest negative for this approach. By that I mean, we built this model in late February, early March with data through mid to late February, and that's how it sits. We update the weather that goes into it as we get more observed weather, but that model is aware of trends and relationships as they existed as of late February at best. So if and as those relationships change, either through the COVID period or as a result of COVID-19, the COVID unaware model will not pick up on that. And I think the biggest pro for this approach is that it is growth aware. So it is aware of patterns in baseload growth through the February period, but it can also project those patterns through the summer period in question. Now for the weather adjusted load approach, it's also weather neutral. The baseline and the comparison both use normal weather. Model error is not an issue because we add it back in. It is agnostic towards outages because we're not using actual load as the comparison. It is dynamic where the no COVID approach is static. So that model, the COVID aware models are updated every day. So they are aware as those relationships change. It can capture those changing relationships. But its biggest attraction is that it is growth unaware. It basically is just compares one year to another and ignores the growth between the two. And I think that's nowhere more obvious than in ERCOT, which was my examples before. This was the moving average of losses using the simulation approach, and this was the same thing using the weather adjusted load approach. So you can see the gap there is basically growth, and you can see that in the early days of the graph in early March, the quote unquote losses in the weather adjusted load approach were positive, around 3%, and that 3% gap roughly maintains, not all the way through, but so you can see that in a growing system, the weather adjusted load approach is going to underestimate the impact of COVID-19. And so for that reason, and also because in the US office, we were just better equipped to take advantage of that approach versus the weather adjusted load, that's the way we've structured our analysis. Our colleagues in London and Auckland were better situated to take advantage of the weather adjusted load approach. So that's what they've seen or what they've used, and I'll show some results from both. So we'll see a little bit of everything here. Okay, so we put together these graphs and this analysis for all of the markets that we forecast around the world, and I've cherry picked a few just because they say something particularly interesting. But if you are interested in a market that I don't mention or don't display, again, you can feel free to reach out. My email will be at the end, and we can get you some similar analysis for the markets you're interested in. I put New England up for two reasons. First of which is this apparent outlier here back in April, late April. And I think it would be easy to dismiss that as an outlier, but when we took a closer look, it turns out, I think we used 6 stations to forecast this footprint. And across all 6 stations, it was raining pretty heavily throughout the day on that day. And that caused us to speculate without enough data to really substantiate. But if we're in where April here is a pleasant weather regime, and if people are working from home, not under direct visual supervision, they may be more inclined to spend more time outdoors. Take the laptop, set up shop on the porch, go for longer walks, what have you, thereby reducing the residential demand. Then if it's raining everywhere, everybody's forced inside, and that demand goes back up. So that could be what's at play here with this outlier. And if it is, I think it's interesting in that the effect would be seasonally fleeting. You get into the hot weather regimes, maybe not as much in New England as here in Virginia, but people are going to be less inclined to set up shop and work outdoors in August than they would be in April. So rain's not going to have that same effect. But it does give us something to look for as we move into the fall, and those temperatures do become more conducive again to being outdoors more frequently. The other interesting thing about New England here is this big dip in early August, or what seems like a big increase in the COVID impact, and we saw the exact same pattern in New York ISO, and this is the effect of outages that I mentioned earlier. This is Hurricane Isaias making landfall in New England and New York, and knocking out some of the infrastructure there. Alberta, I included here just because of all the markets that we've analyzed. They are currently still doing the worst in terms of this percentage load loss. They're still bottoming out, it seems, where most markets bottomed out in late May, early June. And I think the reason for that is the dependence there on the oil and gas industry, which was particularly hard hit. The last numbers I saw for July were that the active drilling rigs were down 70% or almost 70% year over year in Alberta. And that's I think a big contributing factor here. And we see similar responsiveness to that oil and gas impacts in Western ERCOT and Southwest SPP as well. Mexico, I put Mexico up here. They got a little bit later start in terms of feeling the pain of COVID-19 on load than some of the U.S. markets did. But I think more notable than that, between early May and early June, they experienced a much steeper recovery than did any of the other markets, or at least any of the U.S. markets. And that's obviously leveled off here since early June, but they did come back quite quickly, at least to where they're at now. Now this is switching to Europe, and so we're switching to the weather-adjusted load approach. Italy, obviously notable because they were probably the earliest and hardest hit country in this COVID pandemic. And you can see the sharp decline over the month of March. I think that's a much faster decline than most of the U.S. markets. But what's more notable is if you look at the left y-axis there, the scale of their losses is much greater than what we've witnessed in any of the other U.S. markets. I think Cal ISO saw the biggest average daily losses, around 13%, and here we're at 27% when Italy bottoms out. But we can see how they've come back to roughly net zero here recently. New Zealand is also very interesting. Obviously, they eradicated the virus itself within their borders, at least for a good spell. But they also had those, like I mentioned, the very well-defined quarantine policies. So well-defined, in fact, that we can, plot them in the background here. And this red period here, from March into April, is their phase 4 lockdown. Everything is shut down period, and you can see the very, very steep decline over a 2-week period. Really, they lost over 10% of their load. But you can also see how quickly they came back and how early they reestablished themselves in a roughly net zero position in late May, versus a lot of the North American markets that are still struggling to get back to net zero. And now I'll come back to the U.S. This is PJM as a whole. Nothing super interesting here, but I do want to dive a little bit deeper in PJM. So we've got the hourly data backing all of these daily averages. We can also average by hour across a given month to get a sense of the shape deformation as a result of COVID-19. And so this is the PJM total area in April. Was down by 5% at every hour, at least 5%, with that being a good deal higher during the morning ramp up and in the evening hours. And then I also took a look at Penelec to drill down a bit, much harder hit than PJM as a whole. In July, the total had recovered quite a bit, net positive in the midday. Goodly recovery in Penelec, but they had further to go. But I've highlighted Penelec here not because it's of particular interest within PJM, but because we have several clients that participate in the default service auctions in PJM, and we help them forecast their tranche responsibilities. And so we had models ready and available for this analysis for the residential and commercial pieces disaggregated in Penelec. So this April and July, this is just a split up the same data as the last slide for Penelec. And this is for the control zone totals, data from PJM. But using the models that we have for the commercial and residential non-shopping customers, we can take a look at the difference between the two. April is very much what you'd expect. Big losses during business hours where the businesses are closed, and then gains midday in residential loads where people are at home instead of at work. I think what's more interesting than that is the differences, the shape differences in July. A lot of businesses have come back, so those losses are down a bit. Some businesses will never come back, so there's still some down there, and some aren't back to full capacity. But the residential loads have increased at almost every hour, except these midday hours here, 11 to 12. And it's pretty dramatic. And I think it would be easy to assume, well, from April to July, it gets hotter, obviously, so loads go up. But it's important to remember here that we're looking at a percentage difference between two series, both of which are predicated on observed weather. So as it gets hotter, they should both move up. And what this is saying is that observed load is moving up faster than our simulation. So I think it's evidence that the relationships between temperature and load are changing as a result of COVID. And it's more than a level impact from businesses being closed. And I think we can see that a little bit more also in Cal ISO. If we focus here on the August period and this sharp ramp up there, we can see that this is the market that was hardest hit in the U.S. And over the month of August, we basically see those losses get eradicated. But what we've also saw there corresponding with that were extreme temperatures. I think we use 11 stations to forecast this Cal ISO footprint. And on the 19th of August, 7 out of those 11 stations registered highs over 100 degrees. And so what we end up seeing is that the observed loads are outpacing our simulation. So basically what that says is, given, everything we know about the way people respond to temperature based on data through last February, which includes, last summer, and given these 100-degree temperatures, use the raise hands function there for if you can hear me. I know some folks dropped out. I see. Yeah, I got a couple of raised hands. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. All right. I will carry on. You guys missed all the profound stuff that I said when the audio dropped out. It was mind blowing. So moving forward, let me see if I'm still recording. Yes, good. So that's the stuff that we've learned. Moving forward, what might we be able to say? I think it's useful to break down quote unquote COVID impacts on load into 3 different factors. Commercial quarantine factors are the easiest and most obvious. Businesses are closed, so they're not using load, or they're at diminished capacity, so they use less load. These are universally negative, I think, effects, and they are closely tied to government mandates. So as we have seen the government mandates roll back, and as they continue to roll back towards normal, these effects will roll back as well. But I think it's important to remember that these are the effects that will reapply just as quickly if God forbid the virus takes an unfortunate turn, and then we have to put back some of those government mandates. The second piece is residential quarantine. It's kind of the converse of commercial. The impacts are positive. People are using load at home, whereas they would have been using it at work. But it's not, it's not a one-for-one offset by any stretch. And these effects I expect to persist longer than the commercial quarantine effects. Just because and office buildings the government says they can't open doesn't mean that a given company is going to, be quick to reopen. And just because a company does reopen doesn't mean every employee is going to be quick to hop back to the office. So I think that it's going to be slower rolling off. And I also think we may very well see permanent shifts here. I mean, trends in work from home, or work from home was trending up, before this. And now lots of companies that might have been resistant have been forced to see that it can work in a lot of cases, and some they may find it doesn't. And I think you're going to see more pressure from the workforce for work from home, and more realizations from businesses that they can save money on real estate. So you're going to see some of this persist and just become part of the base. And I think the last piece is economic activity. Not all of the businesses that were closed by government order are ever going to open up again, when those orders are lifted. And we know that a recession is going to have, put downward pressure on load. What we don't know is how deep or how long that recession might last. I also think it's important to realize that pretty much all of the data we have and all of the analysis that we've done around COVID impacts has taken place in a cooling regime. And so what we've seen during that cooling regime, we saw a big drop in the spring for lots of obvious reasons. School is mostly out during the cooling regime during the summertime. So while there was an issue early on, it hasn't been an issue for the last 2 months or so. We saw almost universally recovery across the summer, with the exception being Alberta. And a large part of that recovery appears to be driven by additional cooling loads that we would not have otherwise seen absent COVID-19. So now we have to speculate about what we might see as we move into a heating regime. Might we see a drop across the fall? I think the spring drop had more to do with closings and those commercial quarantine impacts. I think we are likely to see a fall drop as temperatures cool, and that extra cooling load driven by the positive residential impacts fall away. But who knows? A big X factor is schools. We've got plenty of data about what load does when kids are in school or out of school, but not when they're in virtual school. So in some places where kids might be going half back and half virtual, we can certainly tell our models that half the kids are in school, but the other half aren't going to be behaving as if it's a snow day or a teacher work day. They're going to be learning, hopefully anyway. So who knows what kind of impact that might have. Might we see a winter recovery? I think this is the most interesting question about the heating regime. Might we see a response to extreme cold that changes in COVID, due to COVID, the way we've seen the response in extreme heat change to COVID? And I think some of the logic is similar. Right now we're seeing, instead of one commercial HVAC system cooling 30 bodies in an office building, you've got 30 residential HVACs cooling those same 30 bodies. So it makes sense why we see extra cooling load. And similar logic will apply in the winter if we're still largely working from home. So will we see that the heating load materialize? And there are a couple of extra factors there. I think first and foremost among them is the prevalence of electricity as a heating fuel, versus its prevalence as a cooling fuel. So in some places it might not be an issue at all. But if and where it is an issue, if it is an issue, this map can help us discern where it might be an issue. And I apologize for the resolution. The best I could find here was a PDF report from the EIA, but it gives you the sense of where this might be an issue. So most of the Southeast and Texas, and with a couple of other states that I was kind of surprised about. But in addition to whether or not it's going to matter with electricity as a heating fuel, it's also going to matter how cold it gets. If we have a mild winter, none of this is going to matter. If we see polar vortexes pushing, freezing temperatures into the deep south again, we could see loads at least approaching, net zero COVID effects, if not, pushing new peaks in some areas, depending on the makeup of the load. So in closing, I think some of the principal factors going forward, just mentioned electric heating. How prevalent is it, and how cold will it get? How much will we need it? I think the composition of the load, residential versus commercial. We have some clients who are municipal or co-op systems serving suburbs outside of major metro areas, so basically bedroom communities. And they're seeing, increases on their systems in this COVID era on the whole. And then some of our clients are their metro counterparts that are seeing decreases. So this will have a big impact on how COVID impacts load going forward. What we don't know a whole lot about is quarantine measures. The putting them in place and taking them down is both a medical and a political question, and so who knows exactly how that's going to play out over time. But obviously there will be implications for power consumption. And then lastly, the $1 million question, the economic recession. How deep will it get? How long will it last? We know it's going to put downward pressure on load, but we don't know for how long. So, and I believe that concludes me talking at everybody portion of the program. And I think we've got at least one question. Let's see. All right. Oh, looks like that one was already answered. If anybody else has any questions, you can feel free to jot those down, input those into the interface now. I'll be happy to hang around for as long as it takes, I guess, to work through them. But if nobody has any other questions, then I guess I won't. Yeah, I'm not showing any unanswered questions. So again, if you have any questions that you don't want public, there's my email address and contact information. NEMA's was presented earlier, but I can get that to you. And if you're interested in seeing the analysis for any of the markets that I didn't get to, let us know. So we got one question. Oh, more, cool. How have the short-term effects affected utility scale solar and wind procurement? That's a good question. I don't know that I can say much about procurements for utility scale solar and wind projects. We have noticed, I don't know that I've noticed a change in the trend of or the rate in which our customers are inquiring about wind or solar generation forecasting for those projects. So from my perspective, which is probably not the best one to comment on those projects, we don't see a real change in people moving forward with wind and solar projects. When do you believe large-scale renewable energy procurement will normalize to pre-COVID levels? Yeah, I think similarly. From our perspective, which again is probably not the best on that particular question, we haven't noticed a change in that. In fact, I mean, we noticed an uptick going into COVID, and those particular projects, I mean, they were so far along by the time you get to reaching out for forecasting, that those have not slowed. So I think if we were to see the impacts of a slowdown in renewable energy generation projects, it's going to be lagged for us, just because I think that's typically where we are reached out to later in that process. All right. And anybody, any other questions? All right. Oh, here we go. Do our forecasts anticipate back to normal loads sometime in 2021, earlier, later, due to these economic variables? We actually do not use economic variables explicitly in our modeling. What we do as a general rule is we detrend the observed load that we analyze, and that trend is going to include lots of things: economic growth being one of them, population growth, changes in energy efficiency appliances or distributed solar penetration, and that's pretty much all lumped together. So we detrend the data, which allows us to sort of identify the trend, and then we can project that forward. Obviously, all of those trends are dramatically impacted, and we don't do enough long-term forecasting to have really been able to decompose how that long-term trend is changing structurally. What we've been doing is really trying to model the COVID effects, but some of that is going to bleed into our trend variables. And so until we can, and that combination is works in the short-term forecasting world, but until we can better differentiate those effects and say, here's the trend and here's the COVID impact, that muddies, or that water is going to be muddy. So in terms of whether we forecast it, loads getting back to normal, that's really, I mean, normal is a difficult metric. You know, and sometime in 2021, I would say, because you have the COVID impact is those three things. I think your commercial and residential impacts will likely get back to normal. Obviously, that depends a lot on the biological impact, which I can't really say anything about. Whether the virus, whether we find a vaccine, whether the virus takes a turn, that kind of stuff. But given recent trends, I suspect that the commercial quarantine, the residential quarantine impacts will likely get much closer to normal through 2021. The recession impacts I think are going to last a little bit longer than 2021. But yeah, that remains to be seen. What is your forecast horizon? Typically, we forecast 14 days out on most of our standard products. Our methods can be adapted using different weather assumptions to forecast further out. So we've gone out, 4 years, 10 years, depending on client needs. But we don't do that. That's not as big a part of our portfolio. And actually, I'm not personally involved in all those projects, so I couldn't comment on what we've seen there for now. We do a lot more of that in Europe, actually. So if you've got specific long-range forecasting questions, we can certainly dive a little bit deeper if you want to reach out directly. Let's see. All right. I don't see any other questions, but I'll give another minute or two. For everybody who's still with us, I do want to make sure I get a chance to thank everybody for taking the time to listen, to tune in. I do appreciate this is my first webinar, so thanks for being a great audience, as far as I can tell. Okay. Oops. All right. Well, on that note, I think I will go ahead and shut it down, let everybody have their time back. But yeah, one last time, my email's there. Please feel free to reach out. Any questions that you didn't think to ask or didn't want to ask publicly. And yeah, again, thank you very much.